Hi, everyone. So it's good afternoon from the UK, and we have participants from all parts of the world. So I'm sure that it's morning for some of you and evening for the others. So welcome to the second IATBR online seminar. And as you know, that this is particularly an initiative to kind of fill up the gap due to the delay of the postponement of the IATBR conference from 2021 to 2022. So I will maybe just wait another 2 minutes before I start, because we have about 200 registrants, and I think people may be joining in 1 or 2 minutes from now. Okay, let's have a formal start. So it's my pleasure to introduce the speakers for today. So we have Dr. Timothy Brathwaite, who is the 2018 winner of the IATBR Eric Pass Dissertation Award for the best dissertation in the field of travel behavior research. And we have also Professor Eric Miller as the discussant. He was the winner of the 2018 Lifetime Achievement Award of IATBR. And if the way we will have today's session, there will be a 40-minute presentation by Dr. Brathwaite, and then there will be discussion on the topic. And the topic for today is the checking the models in statistics, machine learning, and discrete choice, a perspective to bind us all. And let me just give a quick bio of the presenters. So Timothy obtained his PhD in civil and environmental engineering from University of California at Berkeley in 2018 under the supervision of Joan Walker. And since finishing his PhD, he has worked most recently as a data scientist at Stitch Fix Incorporated. And prior to that, he was working as a research scientist at Lyft. Timothy's graduate research centered technically on creating models at the interface of statistics, machine learning, and discrete choice. And these models were then applied to problems of strategic bicycle planning and made available for more general use. Timothy was awarded the 2018 Eric Pass Dissertation Prize, as I mentioned, for his research in this area. And Professor Eric Miller, he's a pioneer in the development and application of agent-based microsimulation model systems in large urban contexts. As the director of the University of Toronto Transportation Research Institute, his research is centered in the implementation of activity-based models for use in operational practice. And he is also the director of the data management group, which has over the last 30 years provided data to government agencies, private sector partners working for the government, and university researchers in support of a wide variety of travel behavior analysis and modeling activities. He is also the founding research director of the Travel Modeling Group, a research consortium that seeks to provide a forum and mechanism for interagency collaboration designed to improve travel modeling practice. So in recognition of his service to the travel behavior community, he has received numerous awards, among which are the 2009 ITE Wilbur S. Smith Distinguished Educator Award. He's also the inaugural winner of the University of British Columbia Margolis National Design for Living Award in 2012 and the 2018 IATBR Lifetime Achievement Award. So without delaying further, I would give the floor to Dr. Brathwaite. And just to mention that if you have any questions, please type them in the question and answer box of Zoom, and we will get to the questions after the presentation. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction. And after the fact, feel free to come back to the slides at your own leisure. Secondly, if you haven't already listened to my original dissertation talk, then please feel free to see the second link that's on the screen sometime after this hour. It contains many more details and background information. That's really the starting point for this presentation. Okay. Now, first, I'd like to thank the International Association for Travel Behavior Research for hosting this seminar, of course, and for inviting me to speak with all of you. And then I'd like to extend some thanks to all of you for showing up, either in the afternoon or in the morning, whatever time it is. Or if you're watching this after the fact, thanks for your time. As usual, if you have questions that are of the sort where I've confused you greatly, then please ask at any time. And if you have questions or comments that are of the sort where I reminded you or sparked some new thought, then please hold those to the end because we should have time to address those in more detail. All right. To begin, the title of this presentation, as mentioned, is Checking Models in Statistics, Machine Learning, and Discrete Choice, a perspective to bind us all. When I think reflectively about questions related to my dissertation, the first sort of question that comes to my mind is, what is it that's really motivating and driving this mix of disciplines of statistics and machine learning and discrete choice? And here there are at least three responses or three motivations that come to my mind. The first one is that there are inherently interesting problems in the choice modeling applications that are current in industry right now. We have things like the choice of what words to use and chatbot companies. You have questions of what locations will people choose to visit and recommendation companies like Yelp. And you have questions about what clothing and what style will a person use to express themselves and companies that profit off of this like Stitch Fix. And so all of these honestly interesting problems will draw quantitative researchers from other fields that are perhaps more boring. And they'll, of course, come to join us, as perhaps they should. The second set of motivations is that there are lucrative business opportunities that are unlocked and can be found when one is able to accurately model how people make choices. And so, of course, if there's a prospect of money to be made, then researchers from all sorts of fields will come join the choice modeling party. And the third set of motivations are these interesting methodological and immediate methodological questions of, on one hand, how can we as choice modelers gracefully adapt the non-choice specific quantitative techniques from other fields to choice modeling problems, and hopefully in as innovative a way as the use of this coffee maker to cook one's hot dogs. Uh, Additionally, we will come to questions about how can we understand and appreciate and assess the unfamiliar adaptations that are created by diverse researchers in fields beyond our own. And that needs to happen very quickly, as there's already a ton of work that's begun. So in light of these motivating questions, we then will come to wonder, how did my dissertation contribute to answering them? And overall, my dissertation modeled a pattern of how one can apply ideas from outside of our field, from statistics, from machine learning to choice modeling issues and problems, all puns intended, of course. So the general algorithm is as follows. You start with a choice modeling problem or pot to contain one's efforts, and you spice it up with some idea from another field. And then you carefully stir the implementation with microeconomic concerns and interpretations for the models that you're building. The result of these demonstrations was my dissertation, entitled The Holy Trinity: Blending Statistics, Machine Learning, and Discrete Choice with Applications to Strategic Bicycle Planning, that we're of course here discussing today. When we come to the specific contributions, we can start with the area of statistics. Here, the choice modeling problem that I was concerned with was the low percentage of bicyclists in household travel surveys, and the sort of ensuing modeling problems that this class imbalance results in. The idea from outside that seemed immediately relevant was the use of asymmetric link functions from statistics. This idea was to use generative processes that allow for unequal rates of adoption and abandonment of one's alternatives, thereby explaining the observed class imbalance. Unfortunately, when I looked, all of the existing statistical asymmetric models were restricted to the binary choice setting. And in the economic context that choice modelers are often dealing with, we have to deal with a number of alternatives that's typically much greater than 2. So my work focused on implementing these asymmetric models at the multinomial level and developing procedures to make sure that everyone else could do so afterwards. This work resulted in a paper published in 2018 in the Journal of Choice Modeling called Asymmetric Closed Form Finite Parameter Models of Multinomial Choice. Next, if we turn to machine learning, the choice modeling problem that I was interested in was, how can we represent the non-compensatory behavior that's often spoken about when individuals are choosing whether or not to commute by bicycle? The idea that seemed most useful to me straight away was to make use of decision trees from computer science. And here there were two economic or econometric considerations that drove the implementation I used. The first was that as choice modelers, we're quite interested in measures of uncertainty, especially when we're considering forecasting into the future. And so for me, this motivated the use of Bayesian estimation methods. The second thing was that it was very important that economic interpretability was maintained. And that motivated me to make use of particular restrictions in the form of the model trees that I used. And so putting them together, we got Bayesian model trees. And this is all described in the preprint that's available on arXiv from 2017. It's entitled Machine Learning Meets Microeconomics, the case of decision trees and discrete choice. The final area of technical contribution from my dissertation was in the realm of causal inference. Here, the choice modeling problem that I was focused on was the selection of roadways by a planning agency or transportation agencies for the purposes of intervening to construct new on-street bicycle infrastructure, such as bike lanes. Given that this problem is all about interventions, it seemed clear to me that we wanted causal models, not associational ones. And so when I looked about, causal graphical models seemed like the spice of choice, because that allowed for, at least to me, a sort of clear way of how to marry the causal inference techniques with the model-based inference that is almost necessary in a transportation context where we're forecasting into the future with never before tried interventions. And so I thought that was a great idea. And then I looked about at how we would implement this. And immediately it was clear that choice modelers were going to face lots of problems from unobserved confounding. To overcome those obstacles, I thought about how could we make use of latent variable models, in particular, integrated choice and latent variable models in the context of front door criterions from causal inference. And so the discussion of those topics is published in a paper and also in the Journal of Choice Modeling from 2018 in the paper Causal Inference in Travel Demand Modeling and the Lack Thereof. All right, given the research that I did, the natural follow-up that occurs to me is to ask what follow-up research has gone on since then. If we start with statistics, the follow-up research that has occurred has all been about applications. In particular, there's a cool application by Associate Professor Dawei Li and his colleagues, where they extend my asymmetric models to make use of covariate dependent asymmetries in the context of route choice models. And that's currently in preparation or in review, one of the two. And in addition, there is some work from Tinessa et al., where they made use of latent class asymmetric models in the context of long distance travel mode choice. And that's also from very recently, from just last year. Turning our attention to machine learning, if you look directly for follow-up work, taking decision trees and the economic interpretations that I ascribe to them, you'll find that actually there hasn't been any. However, if you take a look at the broader agenda that I outlined earlier for adapting outside ideas to discrete choice. That pattern has been broadly followed by a large number of choice modeling researchers who are doing work with neural networks. And so what we've gotten has been this fantastic rise of the neural nets, where novel combinations of choice modeling and neural networks are being produced at a tremendous rate. And it's really great to see. To highlight just one set of work or one body of work in particular, at the next and I believe the final IATBR online seminar for this year, we're going to hear from Dr. Shenhao Wang about the work that he and his colleagues have done on neural networks for choice modeling, and in particular, the foundational work that has gone on with economically interpreting neural networks in that sense. And I'm very much looking forward to it. Finally, if we look for follow-up research on the causal inference work that I did, there is not much to see here. In particular, I know that there is some ongoing work right now with myself and some of my colleagues at UC Berkeley. However, that research is very much still baking. And in many ways, I'm not at all surprised, given that the causal inference issues and problems that I discussed were the last of the problems that I discussed in my dissertation, and they were also the hardest. So to me, it makes sense that there hasn't been much completed application work or extension work of causal graphical models in choice modeling, especially making use of latent variable models as part of it. So in summary, how have the topics from my dissertation aged? I would say that if you come from the perspective of the asymmetric models and their applications, and you look at the broader research agenda in machine learning, specifically with neural networks, then the present usefulness of the ideas in my dissertation have remained. And if you look further abroad at what's going on in industry, if you look at the increasing commonality of choice and of class imbalance problems all throughout industrial choice modeling issues, if you look at the fact that there's still incredible profits to be made from more accurate predictive models and more accurate causal inference models, more credible causal models, both from a private sector and a public sector perspective, there's important stewardship that can go on of resources in both contexts. And in that sense, the opportunities that I identified in my dissertation for the field of choice modeling seem to have only become more important and seem poised to remain so for some time going forward. If we now come to the specifics, what are some of the topics that have not aged well from my dissertation? I say that there is an overall trend or an overall pattern, which is that implementation difficulties have hampered some of the specific methodological advancements that I was pushing from my dissertation. In particular, I haven't seen any application of custom derived asymmetric probability models or asymmetric choice models, even though that's what I was most excited about from the asymmetric work that I did. Similarly, I haven't seen any tree-based models with the sort of economic interpretations that I ascribe to them be used. And I haven't seen any rigorously questioned causal graphs in a choice modeling context, especially with latent variables. And again, the implementation of such models is difficult. And I think that's part of why. On the other hand, for balance, here are some of the good fruits that have fallen from the aged tree of my dissertation. On the first hand, in a statistical sense, choice models are characterized or specified by two functions, a link function and an index function. So my asymmetric work was all about the link function. But the current work going on in machine learning and choice modeling is all about neural networks, and in particular, their use in the index function. And so in that sense, it's very complementary to the work that I did before. And I'm really looking forward to see all sorts of combinations of the two going forward. Outside of that, in machine learning and in causal inference, there's been this great foundational work that's going on with continuous optimization. In the tree-based world, this has been pushed in large part by adapting or converting decision trees to neural networks, and then going from there in terms of continuous optimization. And that opens the door to all sorts of fun and exciting overlap with the choice modeling work that's going on. Additionally, at the same time, there's been tremendous advances in continuous optimization for causal discovery. That is, for estimation of the causal graph underlying a system of variables. And this work will make it so much easier for choice modelers to make use of causal discovery techniques and at least for the discovery of credible causal graphs. Okay, so during my dissertation, if you asked me to look out at all the work that I was doing, and then now when I look back at all the work that's gone on since then, you have a question of, wow, how do you make sense of all that's gone on? And originally, I used to say, all right, you got to go out and you're going to learn every one of those fields, and then you're going to translate one at a time between them as you need to. After working for a couple of years in industry and realizing how slow this is and how difficult this is to do in a deep way that respects what's known by other researchers, I've realized that just really ain't nobody got time for all of that. This is way too slow. It can't go on. So now what I would say in a sort of modern sense is that if you need to make sense of quantitative work in choice modeling from any field, from any researchers, what I would suggest is to make use of simulation. My apologies. Is to make use of simulation-based model checking. And here's what I mean by that metaphorically. Metaphorically, you should think of a soloist, and behind that soloist there's going to be an orchestra or backup singers or a choir. And what we're going to do is we're going to cycle through different groups of musicians behind this soloist. So here, reality plays the role of the soloist, the observed data plays the role of the soloist, and the simulations from our models play the role of the varying choirs or musicians behind this soloist. And so to understand differences between our models, we're going to play these bands one at a time behind the soloist, and we're going to listen for how each of these bands harmonize with our soloists, with our reality, and how well they match. So, okay, for all of the explicit details with math and with examples and with code and all of the great things that you really need to make use of this, please see my paper. Check yourself before you wreck yourself. Assessing discrete choice models through predictive simulations. It's been out since 2018. It's available as a preprint on arXiv, and it's also available on GitHub with all code and examples there. It's at the links shown on the screen. All right, so now let's explain from a technical perspective. What do I mean as opposed to metaphors? Technically, what I mean by simulation-based model checking is that you've got some explanatory variables for X, and you've got the choice process that is used by individuals. Let's call that nature's black box. And then you've got the outcomes of that choice process as it acts on those explanatory variables. This gives you the observed choices, Y. Now we go ahead and we estimate a model that is meant to mimic in some sense, so to describe the choice process that we don't actually observe, so to describe nature's black box. And from our model, we can produce simulated choices. Now, the way that we check how good our model is, or the way that we check for understanding of what our model has learned, is we ask, how similar are our simulated choices to our observed choices? So let's go through this one step at a time. You've got a model. Models have parameters. Let's call those parameters beta. If you're a frequentist, then, or in many contexts, you've likely got a point estimate of your parameters. Perhaps you have a maximum likelihood estimate. So you have beta MLE. If you want to express your uncertainty about the estimated parameters, then in a frequentist context, you may reach for an asymptotic sampling distribution. Here you might find a normal distribution centered on the maximum likelihood estimate with a covariance matrix, which is the negative inverse of the Hessian evaluated at the maximum likelihood estimate. Great. Go ahead and sample from that distribution, from your asymptotic sampling distribution. Alternatively, if you don't want to make so many assumptions, you could go ahead and bootstrap your estimation process. So here you would instead collect bootstrap replicates. In other words, samples from a bootstrap distribution, which approximates one's sampling distribution or one's posterior distribution, depending on implementation of the bootstrap and of perspective of the researcher. Finally, you might be a Bayesian, or you might be employing Bayesian estimation techniques. In that case, please go ahead and sample directly from your, oh, I see there's a question. I will address these questions, one of them later. Actually, I'll address both of these questions in the follow-up period afterwards. Okay, so if you're employing Bayesian estimation techniques, just go ahead and sample from your approximate sampling distribution. Either way, no matter what methodology you use, go ahead and get some samples. Now, once you've got these sampled or simulated parameters, go ahead and predict the choice probabilities for all observations using each one of these sampled or simulated sets of parameters. After you've gotten one set of predicted choice probabilities for each one of your simulated parameters, you're going to go ahead and simulate a set of choices from each of the choice probabilities. This is a straightforward Monte Carlo simulation from a categorical distribution. Now, once you've got your simulated choices in hand, what you are going to need at the same time are statistics that you can use to judge the observed choices versus the simulated choices. And so these are known as test statistics. These statistics can truly be almost anything up to the researcher's design and imagination. For example, you might, in a fictitious sense, choose the share of observations with some y=1, that particular choice when, let's say, a scalar explanatory variable equals 1, perhaps. Once you've got your test statistic in hand and you've got your simulated choices, then go ahead and compute this test statistic once for every single one of your simulated choices. Or I should say every single one of your vectors of simulated choices. And so here you might compute the share of observations, the share of simulated observations that have choice equal to 1 when that scalar x is 1. And you're going to compute that for each of your simulated choices. All right. Finally, you compute the test statistic with your observed choices. And then now you compare the observed value of your test statistic with the simulated distribution of test statistic values that you got in the previous step, in step 5. All right. I'm going to stop here for a brief second because that's totally a lot. And this is typically or normally the point at which I would show you an example straight away to demonstrate all 6 of these steps in a row. I won't do that in this case. In this case, I'm going to instead go back to talk a bit about the intuition behind this process. And I will then come to an example in a few moments. So by way of analogy, for any people who are very familiar with chemistry, for any people who are very familiar with chemistry, I will say that model checking is analogous to a process called mass spectrometry. In both cases, the objective is to characterize and gain a detailed understanding of the compounds that we're working with in our study. In a chemistry context, these compounds are molecules. Imagine carbon dioxide. In a choice modeling context, these compounds are models. And when you're going through the process of mass spectrometry, you're going to process your molecules. And as part of this processing, you're going to give off ions as derivatives. And in an analogous fashion, when you process your model using that 6-step process that I just described in a model checking context, you're going to give off simulated choices. So if you have these derivative compounds, these ions, in spectrometry, you're going to measure physical properties about them. So you might measure the mass of the ions that get produced. In a choice modeling context, we're going to measure the test statistics on each of the simulated choices. Going one step further, in spectrometry, once you've measured the physical properties, the masses, you're then going to plot them on a diagram. You're going to create what's called a spectral diagram. And these are unique per every compound that you're talking about. Similarly, in a choice modeling context, once we've computed our test statistics, we're going to put them on a diagram. We're going to make model checking plots. And again, these are going to be unique per model that we're discussing. So in spectrometry, you then go further and you say, okay, I'm going to compare the spectral diagrams of differing molecules. And this provides one way to understand some of the differences between the molecules that are in your study. Likewise, we're going to compare model checking plots amongst differing models that we're looking at. Here, you can imagine having model checking plots for a discrete choice model right next to model checking plots for a statistics model, and right next to model checking plots for a machine learning model in exactly the same fashion that you would do in spectrometry. And here, one thing that we're going to want to do that's perhaps a little bit different is that we're going to want to make use of many different test statistics, because these test statistics represent differing properties of the models that we're talking about. And so much as if we had a large compound, we're going to want to measure perhaps its height, its mass, its flexibility. We want to measure a bunch of things to get a well-rounded picture of the compound we're working with. And likewise, we're going to want to use a bunch of different test statistics and the plots, model checking plots for these test statistics to deeply understand the models that we're working with as well. So to recap, the disciplinary mix that we're seeing between statistics, machine learning, and discrete choice is, in my opinion, fueled by the hard, the interesting, and the lucrative problems in choice modeling that are apparent in all sorts of industrial sectors. I think that as choice modelers, the way that we should welcome researchers from these other fields, and the way that we should welcome the ideas from other fields into our research, is by following a general algorithm of taking a very clear choice modeling problem, finding an outside idea to add to the mix of our existing work, and then carefully considering the economic interpretations and concerns as we bring these ideas in. We don't want to give up anything. We really just want to add new concerns or add new thoughts. Then, as we go about trying to understand the modeling creations that we cook up, I think that the way we should understand our new work and the work of others is through a process of simulation-based model checking, where we let reality play as a soloist, and we cycle through various fleets of simulated musicians in the background. If you would like to make use of existing code that will make all of the model checking plots that I've ever used or found, please see a Python package called checkers that I developed, and it's very in progress, although I would love any help or any feedback if anyone makes use of it. The link to the GitHub repo for it is shown on the screen. So with that, I'll say thank you all for listening to the end of this, and thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to take questions and comments in the discussion afterwards, and I know there's 4 already in the chat. I'll be sure to get to those straight away. Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Timothy. So before going to the question and answers, let's have a discussion from Professor Eric Miller first, and then we will take all the questions.
Charisma. And thank you, Timothy, so much for just a tour de force presentation. I mean, I loved your thesis back when I read it back a couple of years ago, and tremendous summary here. Very, very rich, very deep, all sorts of great ideas. which I all agree with. So maybe I just stop here and say congratulations. I won't, but I'll try to keep my comments very brief because I want to keep time for the Q&A. So I'm just going to try to make a very few high-level points and responding really to some of your high-level points, not try to get into the technical details of any of your specific models and so forth. We could spend all day talking about things. First of all, again, so many things you said resonated with me. I've always viewed transportation, I know you're focusing in a sense on choice modeling, which is much broader than transportation, but transportation specifically has always been, in my view, an application, not a discipline. And we've always been dependent on the kindness of strangers, in a sense, on others, methodologists, theorists, people from a wide variety of disciplines, bringing their expertise to our application. And I think generally, at times we've done that very well, but also, at various times I think we've gotten locked into, our methods, and I'm thinking particularly of, logits, nested logits. We're very locked into a certain random utility methodology, which has served us extremely well. But I think it's been very necessary for us to break out of that and think more broadly. And so I think we are in a renaissance in terms of new people being attracted to discrete choice modeling, but to transportation and bringing their methods with us. And I think that's enriching us in tremendous ways. And I think, your thesis is a great example of people being innovative, reaching out, looking at not only defining new problems, but thinking about new ways to solve them. So I congratulate you on that. I think you're an example of what we should be doing in the field. And I think a lot of our particularly younger researchers are doing. Second, obviously, the theme of sort of classic econometrics versus machine learning. I constantly reference a session we had at TRB a few years ago. I always forget the title. Econometricians are from Venus and machine learners are from Mars. It was supposed to be a knockdown, drag-out fight between two different camps. It turned out to be a love fest because we both recognize that we need each other, and it's the complementarity of these methods and learning from each other that's very important. And I think in particular, economics or more classic econometricians, choice modelers have learned an awful lot from machine learners about out-of-sample testing, validation methods, new ways of validating models and so forth. At the same time, I think machine learners have been learning about the importance of interpretability. And I think our machine learning methods have improved considerably in terms of how we're able to interpret. So I think this is an incredibly welcome trend. I would note that I think it's much more than neural networks. The neural networks are extremely powerful, but we're seeing many types of machine learning methods being used to explore different problems. Certainly in our own work, we just routinely run both kinds of models and compare and contrast and learn from both. So I think that's a trend that we're going to continue. I'm extremely happy about your talking about causal inference and causal graphs and the need to dig more deeply into causality. I think this is an extremely important issue. I had a PhD student recently digging into this using various methods, a completely different application, not choice modeling per se. That's unpublished work, unfortunately, but I think, or at least to date, but I think as a field, we need to be taking causality much more seriously and looking at the methods we can use to actually try to, get beyond mere correlation. And again, I would say as a criticism of our field, I think for too long, we've been too happy to, again, run our even fancy schmancy, latent class, mixed logit models, whatever, on whatever variables we happen to have on hand, and then, establish some correlations, and then we try to explain them. I think we need to be digging much deeper into the theory underlying travel behavior in this case, and using various ways of identifying causal inference in a way that I don't think we've done enough of. Similarly, I'm just so happy to hear you talk about simulation testing. This is something my group has been doing for a while now. It's not, in my view, it's not enough to, again, run the logit models or whatever it is, get your t-stats out, look at elasticities, do the sorts of things we do, write up the paper and declare victory. I think we need to be running simulations all the time, to be testing our models. It could be scary. We've published a few papers over the years looking at location choice models we've built. And then when we simulate, we see how poorly those models really are in terms of actually trying to explain where people are going and why. So I think if we're to learn from our models, going that step of taking simulation based on the models seriously, I think is absolutely essential to advancing our field and truly learning. Models are hypotheses. We're all taught that, but again, we can't stop that hypothesis testing. Can't stop with just saying, oh, we've got significant t-statistics with expected signs. And I think this ties back to the causality as well. We have to understand why our models work and not. And just very, very briefly, you mentioned implementation challenges. I think this is a continuing theme. I've been in this field for a long time, as long as I can remember, at TRB and IATBR elsewhere, talking about the gap between the research state of the art and the operational state of practice never narrows. It's probably wider than ever. I think a challenge to the behavioralists in our field is how can we better translate our behavioral understandings, which are in many cases getting very sophisticated, into actual improved operational models. Those of you who know me know that this has been a passion of mine. So again, I welcome your comments on that. And finally, I think your application of actually modeling the decisions of where to provide bicycle lanes is a very unique one, in that we spend 99.999% of our time modeling the demand side. We have almost no models of supply decisions, some of which make sense because in many cases these are policy decisions that maybe we really don't want to be modeling. But I think there's lots of situations in which we need more endogenous modeling of supply decisions, particularly as we get into more dynamic simulations of evolutions of urban systems. We really need to, I think, be able to endogenize at least some of the supply decisions. So I think that's a very nice, example of that. So, Charisma, I'm going to stop here to give people a bit of time at least to ask some questions. Thank you very much for the opportunity to comment.
Okay. Should I start with some of the questions in the chat, Charisma?
Yes, I think that will be the best use of the time.
Okay. If I start from the beginning, and I apologize for the brevity, these will be very pointed and very quick answers to these questions, because there's a good number of them, which I thank you for. First, what do I believe are the current main issues in choice modeling regarding causality? In my opinion, it's this notion that one should model the treatment assignment. So we have all these explanatory variables in choice models, and those or some subset of those are often what we consider as our treatments, and they don't arise in this independent fashion from each other. Yet the implicit assumption behind standard models would be that they do. And in a causal inference sense, that can cause lots of problems when considering how interventions will play out over time. And so I'd say that building causal graphs that account for those and building models that follow those causal graphs would be the first order of business, in my opinion. Next, there's a question about Bayesian additive regression trees leading to a random forest being different from an ML random forest. I remember the thing that you're discussing. The precise statement that I was making is that in a machine learning random forest sense, because of the fact that you are bootstrapping on every time that you build the tree, no matter how large, essentially, even though your data set size continues to grow larger and larger, you still get differing differing trees out of the individual processes. So no matter what, you kind of always end up with a collection of n distinct trees. Whereas in a Bayesian additive regression tree context, as your data set gets larger and larger, these are Bayesian models, so there's a concentration of probability, and that converges on a particular tree that gets the highest amount of probability mass in the posterior distribution. And so that's the difference. Like asymptotically, you end up with like one tree as opposed to a collection of trees. Okay. There's a question about choice modeling and decision trees, and choice modeling and oh wait, can we let me go back to it. Okay, so there's a question about the scope of choice modeling and machine learning, as in, should we stick with neural networks or incorporate, I believe it seems, other machine learning classifiers, support vector machines and otherwise? I would definitely say go for all of them. I had overly ambitious dreams in the PhD of trying to, in one fell swoop, see if you could find connections between all of them. It didn't happen, but that was the thought the entire time. I think absolutely we should go for all of these sorts of models. Next, there is a question about why did I think that asymmetry in the link function would work for class imbalance? In other words, can I have perfectly symmetrical models that also explain class imbalance? Yes. Is it possible that you can have perfectly symmetrical models that explain class imbalance? It's totally possible. You could just imagine having a really strong negative alternative specific constant in the utility for those alternatives. There's really low alternatives. But the point is that that's not the only way that class imbalance can occur. And that's perhaps not the best way or the most explanatory way for class imbalance. To say so would be to make another assumption. And so what I do is I just estimate it. If it's the case that simply having a strong ASC will account for it, then the shape parameters in my asymmetric models will be insignificant. And so you won't see any effect of it. But if it's the case that no, actually the constants in a symmetric probability function aren't enough, well, then my models will show some significance in the estimation of the shape parameters afterwards. And the idea is just make less assumptions and we can estimate instead of assuming. And why I got the idea was because in statistics, they already showed benefit from this in class imbalance situations for binary choices. And so I said, hey, if it already works, why wouldn't I just take something that works for 2 choices and see whether it works for more, which I did. All right. We have some questions about how to develop neural networks. That's a very large question. I'll leave that to Shenhao in the next talk. And I'll go further to a question about, given how challenging causality is, does this suggest that discrete choice experiments might be even more important in the future? Yes, but always in a complementary sense of, there's been lots of work with all these hypothetical bias and issues with stated preferences versus revealed ones. But I think that there's great complementarity to be had, as you just mentioned. Okay, and lastly, I know we're at the hour and out of time. If you need to drop away, feel free. Aditya, how does this simulation checking approach fit within training cross-validation? Okay, and is there a bottleneck with sample size of observed data? In practice, as in when I worked at Lyft with like millions of observations, I haven't really found an issue with simulation-based model checking. The issue is with plotting more so than anything. The simulations can always be done. Then you ask about cross-validation and train test splits. There, you can use simulation-based model checking, and I do in practice with both. I'll do simulations on my test sets or on held out sets and also assess what goes on in that sense. So they're totally complementary and not one instead of the other. Okay, that's all the questions that I got. Thank you so much for coming and for listening and engaging with me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Timothy, for your presentation and the answer to the questions. I think Professor Kara Kuckelman had some follow-up questions as well, but maybe you can just have some email exchanges with her clarifying your answer to her question. And so we are just going to wrap up for the sake of time. And Eric, thanks a lot also for adding your great insights. There was a lot of food for thought for the others working in these areas. And I'm sure that everyone found kind of a lot of exciting takeaway points from both the presentation and the discussion. And before I finish, I would also like to especially thank Christina and the other members of the conference and outreach team of UC Davis for their for their support in setting up this webinar and all the technical side. So thanks a lot. And having said that, we're going to wrap up now, and the recording will be available in the IATBR YouTube channel later. And also our next seminar will be on in November 29. No, I forgot. Let me, I will send a reminder to the date, but that's going to be by Dr. Shenhao Wang. And it's also closely related to this topic. He worked on neural network and choice modeling, bridging the gap between these two. So those who are interested about this topic will be interested about that presentation as well. So thanks again, everyone, for your attendance and the questions. So bye for now.